voices that you hear in the background are singing in one of the indigenous languages of Great Britain, though this is often forgotten, and spoken by around 600,000 people in Wales. Despite often brutal efforts at repression, the Welsh language still survives in many areas of Wales, and Welsh immigrants continue to maintain their distinct identity and culture in faraway places such as Tasmania. And the proliferation of Eisteddfods in Tassie is perhaps one indication of this. Now, my guest for this episode, Hugh, is a proud Welshman and a relatively recent arrival, having come to settle in 2021 after much tribulation to join his partner who had come to start a job at the university in early 2020. Hugh grew up on a farm near the town of Carnarvon in northwest Wales, into a Welsh-speaking family, and at a time when Welsh language was undergoing something of a revival in schools. Although in Tasmania his Welsh speaking is mostly confined to dogs and babies, more about that later, modern technology allows him to speak Welsh to his grandchild and daughters in the UK. And to hear more about this, listen on.
I was born in northwest Wales and was privileged to have been brought up in a very rural and beautiful area with the mountains behind me and the sea in front of me, in an area around Carnarvon in northwest Wales, which is very beautiful and has this amazing, great big medieval castle plonked in it, which my grandfather was a stonemason at. It was a real privilege, I think, to be able to grow up in that particular part of the UK. So I was brought up on a farm, a dairy farm, and one of my earliest recollections is walking through a field when my dad was mowing it, and he got very angry because he couldn't have seen me. I would have been less than 3 at the time, and I was doing something incredibly dangerous. But it was a real privilege to grow up in the country, and there are lots of resonances here in Tassie with where I was brought up. You know, not too far away from the sea, mountains behind you, and lots of space to be a kid. I had the privilege of being born in the 1960s, and I think there would have been some constraints and limitations on me had I been a little bit older or born into a different time. But being a child of the 1960s, where there were civil rights protests taking place in lots of places all over the world, it meant that my life was a little bit freer, perhaps, than my elder siblings. So, brought up on a small farm. I'm the youngest of 7 children, and my dad needed extra hands on the farm, and my mum never felt healthier than when she was pregnant. That's what she used to say. And as far as we're concerned as kids, the 7 of us, we're now down to 6. Unfortunately, my elder brother, who lived in Scotland, he passed away recently. But those of us that survived, we're still in contact very regularly. We'll post pictures of what we're up to, that kind of thing. And we sort of bonded over doing farm chores as kids. Anybody who's ever been brought up on a farm will know exactly what I mean by that. You have to, toil away when the work needs doing. And it was a real privilege growing up there in lots of ways. As I said, being able to actually live life through the medium of Welsh, which is a privilege which only about 600,000 people in Wales have. I was brought up through the medium of Welsh, went to school, and was introduced to English, obviously, through the media. But I was bilingual by the time I was 7.
So the first language that you learnt was Welsh?
Yes, that was the one at home. So my mum and my father both came from Welsh-speaking backgrounds. And by now, I'd say, as far as the family is concerned, then most of the 7 have moved out. 4 of the 7 have moved out of Wales, and 3 still live there. None of those that moved out of Wales, though, have been able to pass on the language. But interestingly, my daughter, who was reared in Wales, my eldest daughter, she now has an 18-month-old boy. And because of the accessibility of digital media, my grandson is being brought up bilingually, Welsh and English, in Leeds, in Yorkshire, in the north of England. I don't know how other people, as part of the series and the project, think about this, but whenever I see a baby or whenever I have a pet, I see somebody's pet, I've got to hold myself back from not speaking Welsh. My reaction, first language that springs to mind, I'll speak Welsh. It doesn't really matter if the dog doesn't understand, it's the tone of voice, and the same is sort of true with a baby. But I will rarely speak Welsh when I'm here in Tasmania, but maybe if you're pushing a pram in the street and the baby's gurgling, I will say a little thing in Welsh or something.
And so you grew up mostly hearing Welsh around you in the house and in the local community?
Absolutely. I come from an area just south of Carnarvon. Beautiful place, absolutely wonderful place. Not dissimilar, as I've said, to Tasmania. And when I was growing up, about 80% of the population around me spoke Welsh, according to census statistics. And probably one of the Welsh-speaking areas of Wales still. But there has been a bit of a decline over the years. But whilst there has been this decline, there's also been an interest, especially in those areas of industrialised Wales that were heavily anglicised during the beginning of the 19th century. Welsh language education became quite popular from the 1960s onwards. So when there were these civil rights movements happening all over the world, there was within Wales an increased awareness of the importance of keeping the language alive. And it corresponded to the drowning of a particular valley in northwest Wales, quite close to where I was, in order to provide industrial Liverpool with water. And despite the fact that all of the MPs that were in the House of Commons in London representing Wales voted against the motion and the bill to allow this drowning to happen, it still went ahead. And it was essentially the point at which, the spark that basically set off a powder keg, really, in terms of awareness that despite the fact that we have representation in a parliament, then we're never going to have, as a nation, the outcomes that we would like that aren't first filtered through the lens of London. I think it's wonderful when you go to different places and you have a sense of place that's enhanced by the language. And I don't really want to sort of extol the virtues of, using language as a means of point of difference. I think what I see a separate or an additional language that you might have does is provide you with a different way of looking at the world. Idioms, proverbs, all sorts of things can give you a different insight into what perhaps a culture might regard differently. And I'm reminded of that all of the time when somebody asks me, oh, what does that mean? I recently came across, for example, somebody talking about the names of trees in Welsh, and I hadn't really thought about it before. But a sycamore is called a sycamore withen, okay? Or an oak is called a derwydden. So withen frequently accompanies the name of a tree. But that withen is derived from a Welsh word meaning knowledge. And I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's a reflection of the fact that in Old Welsh, and possibly ancient Celtic culture, then trees were regarded as the harbours of knowledge.
I know Chartists from Wales, a lot of them were sent to Tasmania in the mid-19th century. There's quite a connection there, because they were a bit of sort of troublemakers, weren't they?
Chartists, wow, yes, certainly were, as far as the authorities are concerned. And what's more, a lot of the Chartists, when investigations were made into their activities, there'd be a person who was sort of brought in to the community and they couldn't understand because the Chartists could speak both English and Welsh. A lot of them just Welsh. So they could have these subversive conversations without being understood. And I mentioned earlier on about the fact that there is a bit of a resurgence in the Welsh language. Well, as a result of what happened during the Chartist times, there was a schools inspection, a report, a big report, and it was bound in these big blue books. And the term in Welsh for this whole episode is brad y llyfrau gleision, which means the treachery of the blue books. And essentially what happened was that these 3 school inspectors from England were appointed to go around schools in Wales and make an assessment. The authorities are sort of responding to the fact that there was this increased population in Wales at the time as a result of the industrial times. People had moved in, a lot of them had learnt Welsh, and then the authorities would lose control because they didn't understand what was going on. And a concerted effort was made with this school's inspection. The inspectors would go to schools and ask kids questions in English. And of course, if the kids hadn't been exposed to English, then they wouldn't understand. So they were deemed to be sub-intelligent. And then during the Victorian era, efforts were made to eradicate Welsh from schools. And a particularly nasty practice was something called the Welsh knot. If a teacher was to overhear a child speaking Welsh during the course of the school day, they were given a piece of wood or slate or something on a rope to put around their neck with the letters WN, Welsh knot, on it. You should not speak Welsh. If that child then overheard another child speaking Welsh during the course of the day, they would hand it to them. But at the end of the day, whoever wore the Welsh knot would get some corporal punishment, would get slapped about, or they would get smacked by a cane. So that sort of taught the population to not speak Welsh. And during the course of the 19th century, then you could see that the numbers of people speaking Welsh plummeted. But it was still kept alive in churches and chapels especially. And that sort of chapel culture is very important in the background of Wales as well, because it is non-conformist, it is sort of Chartist in its sort of vibe. And I think that, I've been influenced a lot by that, but I've also been spared a lot of it because of the various civil rights movements that happened.
And growing up, you said you were just learnt Welsh only at school until 7.
Yeah.
And so when you had the dual languages, did you feel like there was like almost like a switch in identity when you went into English or went to Wales? Because I imagine you used them in slightly different contexts.
I think, yes. As I went through school, then, and it isn't necessarily the case by now that this happens in Wales, but as I went through school, then as the subjects became, shall we say, more complicated, then they were introduced to me in English. By now, and certainly it was the case for my children, they got Welsh medium education until the point that they were 18 and then went on to university. And indeed, by now, there are lots of courses that you can follow across all of the range of university subjects. You can now study them through the medium of Welsh in universities in Wales. But when I was going through school, then I was gradually introduced to English. And I don't necessarily think of myself as Welsh. I think of myself as bilingual, English and Welsh. And it's literally like changing a gear in your head. And I'm, perhaps because of the fact that I've been introduced to English in a different sort of way, things are a little bit more... When things become more formal, then perhaps I'm better at English than I am at Welsh. But interestingly, when I went and worked in Wales, I worked in a lot of jobs because I've been involved in a lot of projects and different employers. But for the public sector roles that I've been involved with in Wales, then having the ability to be able to draft a letter, to speak to somebody, to make a presentation in Welsh and English has been extremely beneficial. I had, as a 12-year-old, the huge sort of trauma, unfortunately, of my father dying very quickly and unexpectedly. And it made me grow up. I had lots of older siblings, but many people who knew me as a child said that I sort of became very adult-like at that point, assuming quite a lot of responsibility for things. And I became a very serious and dedicated student at school. Okay. But I also had lots of siblings that provided me with role models. And my elder siblings in particular, you know, they'd done very well academically, and they were able to, shall we say, fly the nest successfully as a result of what they were able to achieve academically. So I was able to sort of learn a lot from their lived experience. So I realised that a way to be able to actually provide me with a passport to see the world and perhaps move to Tasmania one day and find a role in which I could contribute to community might be to do well at school.
Yeah. So when you were at high school, perhaps getting near the end, like, did you have some sort of ambition or idea of where life was going to lead you?
Well, I've always been a generalist, and I really struggled at school to think, oh, what would I really like to be able to do? Okay. And I don't know if it's something Welsh or something that was sort of instilled in us from, especially my mother. But I always wanted to do something that would benefit community somehow. And indeed, most of my brothers and sisters, elder siblings, that's the kind of job that they've done. You know, I'm talking about probation officers working as administrators for governmental departments, a radiographer, that sort of vocational sort of role. I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I was a kid, but at the point at which I went to university, I decided what I'd do was study biology, which is something that had always inspired and interested me. Growing up on a farm, quite close to the coastline, I had the privilege, as I said, of seeing lots of different kinds of plants and animals. And when the time came for me to go to university, then I studied biology and put off the day when I would decide what I was going to actually do when I grew up. And having studied biology, what I then moved on to do was I studied countryside management or rural resource management, and thereafter became a countryside ranger in Wales. So I became very good at looking after nature, but it's quite an expensive thing, is conservation. Yeah. And it isn't necessarily very well funded, or at least it wasn't in the late 1980s and early 90s in the UK. So I constantly had to actually apply for funding in my various roles, and I became rather good at that. And that's what I'm doing now. And that's what I do currently in Tasmania, is I am a sole trader and I provide support to academics specifically who are in the process of putting research applications together. So I help academics to put research applications together by now. So there's a bit of a continuity story there for you.
Did you transition directly from being a ranger into this kind of project?
What actually happened was I worked as a ranger, and having worked as a ranger, I then went to work for Europe's largest conservation charity, which a lot of people perhaps will have heard about, but they will associate it with country houses, and that's the National Trust. So I went to work for the National Trust in England and Wales, and I was there for about 9 years, and like I said, I got quite good at putting funding applications together. And having worked there for 9 years and loving it, I then went on to work for an associate organisation called the Prince's Trust, which was established by King Charles when he was the Prince of Wales. I went to work with them, and I was essentially a coordinator of an environmental grant scheme. And I was there, and I was dispensing small grants for community groups who were doing really interesting things in support of environmental improvement across Wales. And it was really fun, really nice, interesting job. And that involved quite a lot of travelling. And it was when my kids were young and needed support, and I basically moved back. I moved to be closer and to a job that kept me at home more. And interestingly, what happened there was that I actually got to manage putting a facility together that enabled 250,000 people to recycle their domestic waste. And that used a lot of European funding. And at that point, I got to be an expert in handling European grants as part of a large project. And from there, I got a job working for a university, helping academics put applications together for European funding. And from there, I've sort of got to where I am now.
But I guess all that was pre-Brexit, when there were a lot of European fund, because as I understand, Wales benefited quite a bit from European funding schemes.
Absolutely right. I actually got remarried on the 25th of June 2016, and Brexit, the result was published on the preceding day, on the 24th of June, after an election on the 23rd of June. And on arguably the happiest day of my life, I also was nursing a concern that, I wasn't going to be able to continue doing what I was going to do anymore, because with the departure from the European Union, the cohesion policies that existed to try and balance the opportunities and economic opportunities that existed between the regions of Europe, that disappeared. And there was an awful lot of European structural funding as a result of cohesion policies coming into Wales. Wales hasn't really sort of recovered after the industrial era, really. It's doing so, but a lot of the economic development was sort of guided from England, and there isn't a replacement to the cohesion policy that the European Union had after Brexit. And stepping back a little bit from the detail of that particular narrative, it was really obvious to me on the morning of my wedding, with people assembled there, some of whom had voted for Brexit, some of whom hadn't, that those that had voted for Brexit had basically withheld from me the power to be able to actually determine what would happen in my relationship. And essentially, after being given redundancy, it was my partner that then was holding the reins when it came to determining where we were going to live and work. And luckily, my partner chose to come and live and work in Tasmania, which is a wonder.
How did you meet your husband?
Through a mutual friend. So a mate had worked at the local hospital, and he had a soiree, and then met my husband there. And that was back in 2006. That's probably about 2 years after my former wife and I had separated. And then, been together almost 19 years now.
So there was quite a big gap between meeting and getting married. Well, why did you decide to get married, I suppose?
Because it wasn't possible previously. So, civil partnerships were something that I think came in the UK much earlier, and we could have had a civil partnership, but for me, again, making it easier for other people to follow through the door is one of my life missions. I felt it was important to wait until such time as marriage equality was fully realised in the UK. And also, I had 2 kids, and it's no surprise that I got married when my youngest child was just over 18. So I thought that, that it was probably best for all sorts of reasons associated with what would happen if I died in a car crash or something. It would be easier once my kids were adult. Yeah, it just felt like the right thing to do at the time. And then there was the Brexit bombshell. We actually got married at a place called the Centre for Alternative Technology, which is quite famous in Europe because it was established by a group of eco-warrior hippies in the early 1970s. They basically bought this old slate mine with the vision of transforming it into somewhere where they could live sustainably and teach people from across the world to live sustainably. Yeah, they developed a conference centre there, and you can go there, find courses on solar energy production or greenhouse making technologies, and went over there. They, as part of the conference centre, we actually got married there. They had a licence to conduct wedding ceremonies there. So it was just very convenient, quite close to home at the time.
But what was the spur to come to Tasmania in the first place and to leave Wales?
I think the spur was my partner, my husband, realising that there would be great opportunities in terms of his career. He was to assume a chair and to become a professor, which was always an aspiration of his. So on assuming the director's role with learning and teaching, he could then get a chair. So that was a big tick in the list of bucket list career goals. So as far as Tasmania is concerned, there isn't anything I think you can't grow here. So in terms of agriculture, it's really interesting and stimulating. But certainly in terms of impact, his department has become the most, well, it's number 1 in the world in terms of research impact, which is incredible. And the collective effort across the department that's been made by the whole team with his leadership is incredible. So it's number 1 in the world. And that's, in itself, is enough of a draw. When you're involved with higher education, you don't think regionally necessarily. You're competing against the best in the world. For every graduate that the university produces in agriculture, there are 6 jobs possibly available for them in Tasmania. Okay. There is a huge call because of the importance of agriculture to the local economy. Anybody who's listening to this, who's part of a partnership, you realise that there are times when what your opinion might hold more sway, carry more sway, and there are other times when you have less sway over things. And as a result of what happened with Brexit, then certainly I had less sway because I was out of a job, I didn't have the continuity of that sort of role. And under those conditions, then you put your best foot forward and you try a different tack. And as far as my background is concerned in project management, I thought, I can apply this in Tasmania. And another way, perhaps, of saying it as well is that whilst my husband had the specialist skills, I had the more generic skills and qualifications in project management that I could apply in other places.
So I guess you also had a bit of flexibility in the sense that you weren't tied to any job back home. Things were a bit open for you.
Yeah. I've children from a previous relationship and they'd grown up. They're pretty independent. And I thought, if I am going to have an adventure with my husband, then now is the time to do it. And yeah, no regrets. I'm really enjoying it.
Tell me a bit more about your experience of coming to Tasmania. Not the obviously you came for a bit of a visit, but then the whole drama around because your husband came in 2019. That was right?
Yes. And a job offer was provided, and it was incumbent on him having working visa, which he applied for. And it was only at the point at which the working visa was provided that his post was sort of sorted and approved. And he then put in his resignation at his old place, that we were able to lift the handbrake on things and to progress. But the advice that I'd had was to apply for a working visa after getting in initially on a tourist visa. So we essentially got to Australia at different starting points when it came to immigration. And when I came with him in the August of 2019, I had practical things that I needed to complete at home. So we literally got to confirm his job offer at the end of May. He put in his resignation, and he had to serve 3 months' notice. So that was, June, July, August, the end of August. So he was able to confirm starting at the University of Tasmania at the beginning of September of 2019. And what actually happened was we put the house on the market in Wales, and we decided we're not going to keep a house there. We're going to commit to this project and this adventure. And what happened was I came over with him, and he started immediately seeing people at work, and I then was the person who went to find accommodation here in Hobart initially. And I did all of the practical things. And then my job and my work enabled me to do that. And I was, as actors might say, in between jobs at the time. And I then had a few weeks after settling into Hobart. I then flew back to the UK to oversee the completion of the sale of the house. But it got delayed. And my brother's son wasn't very well. He had brain cancer, and I helped out providing support there for a while. And whilst I was doing that, I was approached by a former colleague at a university in Wales. Could you come up and help us out with this project application? Fine, right? So it'll be about a 3-month thing, okay. I got myself doing that for a while, and that took me into the beginning of 2020 to February, and the house sold in that time, which is great. And it enabled me then to be able to actually say, right, okay, I can now buy a ticket to fly to Australia. And I bought a ticket in February for the end of March, the 28th of March, 2020. I was thinking, it'll give me time. My eldest brother, who lives in Scotland, he's not very well. He's got prostate cancer. Blah, blah, blah. I'll see all of my siblings, and I'll have a grand tour to wave goodbye to people and see you later. And I did this, and there was this story appearing in the news all of the time, this unexpected flu thing in China. And then things just got worse and worse. And I think it was on the 20th of March 2020 that Australia closed its borders. Yeah. So with less than a fortnight to go before I was flying here, I found myself homeless because I was lodging with a mate at the time, and husbandless and jobless, and with no guarantee of when I could get into Australia. It took from, that was in March, but I wasn't actually able to get to Australia until the end of December 2020. And I then did some quarantining in Adelaide for 2 weeks, and then got on a plane the very same day with my certificate, and then arrived in Hobart. And then on seeing my husband at the airport, I was not allowed to touch anybody because I was escorted by police to another quarantine facility nearby the airport. I had to do a little bit more quarantining there. It's very difficult to remember how things were like, during COVID times, but it was the uncertainty really that got a lot of people down. and then not knowing when things would happen or not happen. So it was great to be able to actually have an end to that uncertainty and to have arrived here, as I did in January of 2021. And on arriving here, I discovered that my husband's job was going to be moved up to Launceston. And I said, look, rather than find a job in Hobart, what I'm going to do is wait until we're settled in Launceston and then I'll find a job. And interestingly, I got a job working for the Department of Justice, but it was over the whole of the state working on a project. And a lot of the time I actually spent down in Hobart for the 3 years I was working on that project. So I got lots of opportunities to meet with mates that I'd made when I was living here. Having arrived here in the January, I think I just happened to be in a pub in South Hobart one evening with my husband having a meal, I think in the first week we were here in that January. And then we just happened to bump into a group of mates, people that became mates. And it's a gay men's group, well, primarily mental health, but social group. And we were able to make connections instantly that way. It was great. And because I wasn't in a job when I arrived in Hobart, subsequently I've sort of been able to progress my visa applications and so on as well. And I'm currently putting a citizenship application together. Because at that time I wasn't working, I was able to do a lot of the social secretary stuff, you know. And I was able to go out with mates, perhaps those that were doing work in retail at the time, and they were working on weekends, but they were available to go out. And I literally was doing something with a different friend every day of the week, you know, going on walks, going on hikes, and having a wonderful time and seeing a lot of the natural gems of the south of the state. And I would also say that because I didn't really know, you know, not the youngest of spring chickens, I didn't really know whether or not my application for a working visa would get approved. So I didn't know when this adventure would finish. So I made a great effort, I think, in the first weeks and months when I was here to go and travel and do as much as I could to see as many of the Tasmanian highlights as I could. And went over to Strahan, went over to Marrowa in the northwest of the state, went to Stanley, went to the very south of the state to Cockle Creek, went over to the Tasman Peninsula, did all of the tours that I could possibly afford the time to do and the money to do, and had a wonderful time. And I've been privileged, I think, to be able to do that in lots of ways. Many Tasmanians that I've spoken to haven't been able to do that. If they've had holiday time, then there's been a compulsion perhaps to go somewhere warmer and spend their money, you know, in more tropical climates perhaps. But I've loved it. I've had a whale of a time. I've loved it. And I love living here. There are lots of things that remind me of home in terms of the topography, but I'd say the community. People look out for each other, especially once you get out of the middle of the city in Lonnie or Hobart. People look out for each other. I went on Saturday to this really bonkers event at my local village hall. People look out for each other, as I said. And a local stalwart of the community who I'd never met previously had put on events. He'd hired the village hall and he invited people to bring some vinyl if they had some, and to play tracks. He would disc jockey, and you'd have free entry if you bought a shepherd's pie with you. Okay? So when a flyer arrived in the post, I thought, I'm well into this, I'm definitely going to this. That sort of community thing, I think, is really strong in Tasmania, and it reminds me a lot of home. I may not have talked much about it before, but culturally at home, there is always something going on. You even have a Steddfods here in Tasmania. They're a big thing. The National Eisteddfod of Wales, it's a peripatetic thing, it goes to different places. This year, I actually boarded a plane on the day when the peripatetic National Eisteddfod that my uncle used to be the main organiser of, by the way, in the south of this country. That was at a place called Wrexham, which many listeners to this podcast might have heard about because of some Hollywood film stars that have bought the football club, and it's one of the oldest in the UK. Series. But anyway, the National East Edward was on, and the National East Edward is sort of like the culmination, really, of several East Edwards that happen at local level, and then the great and the good will eventually get to perhaps compete at the National East Edward in all sorts of artistic ventures, but the grassroots is at the village level, and then it helps keep the culture alive. So that sort of community, bring your vinyl, bring your shepherd's pie, bring a poem to recite sort of thing, is something that really speaks to me.
One of the things that Welsh are most commonly associated with is choral singing.
No, I've not gotten involved with the choir yet in Tasmania, and it's partly because of where we live rurally now, but I don't think there has ever been a year of my adult life prior to coming to Tasmania when I haven't been in at least one choir. So it is a stereotype that in my case is true. So when I'm not shagging sheep and singing and going down the mine, there's not many hours left in the day if I'm not doing one of those things, yeah. So there is, maybe in a small town, there'd be like a mixed choir with men and women, and then there may be a male voice choir. There may be a youth choir, and there may be a women's choir. So some people, and I may be thinking specifically of one sister here, they may be in multiple choirs, and it's very vibrant, the choral scene. And then just happened to look at, these reels that keep popping up on your phone if you're on social media, on Instagram or Facebook at the moment. And there's always something like Britain's Got Talent or America's Got Talent, and then the choirs come on. And invariably, if it's Britain's Got Talent, there'll be a Welsh choir. And then everybody cries emotionally and has this breakdown when they say, well, actually, that's sort of like normal life. Yes. That's nothing special. Why are you crying? It happens all the time in Wales. So it is a bit of a truism and a stereotype. But not everybody does sing or wants to sing. But in Wales, you're encouraged to do so. And it's a way to socialise as well as, perform. I've not really lived outside Tasmania in Australia, and I gather that Tasmania has perhaps this image as being maybe a little bit more inbred or backward. That's unfair, in my opinion. What I would say is that I now live in an Australian state which is the most progressive when it comes to LGBTQIA+ communities. And that's something that I feel that I need to do more with. And I think that as individuals, I think all we could ever do, in making a contribution is make it easier for people that come after us, be it our children or, other people that we associate within our communities. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, I'm doing voluntary work now with some community groups. And whilst I was working for the Department of Justice, then I was part of their liaison group. Just making the door a little bit wider for those people that follow. Pushing the door a little bit more open and getting people to be a little bit more progressive in their thinking. A great measure of how you regard equality, I think, is when you swap the language around, okay? And you'll have representatives from Israel and Palestine as part of this project. But recently, with the news that we've been hearing, the terrible news of what's going on in Gaza, for example, I swap the thing around, and then I'm amazed at how terrible it would be if you would swap, tens of thousands of Israeli children now dying because of malnutrition. When you start swapping the language around, you realise how unfair and unequal things are. And I think if there's anything I can do whilst I'm here, and I hope to be here in Tasmania for a while, and to contribute to the community and the improvement of the community,